PowerSlave is one of the most underappreciated first-person shooters of all time. It's a game originally released back in 1996 and developed by Lobotomy Software. Centering around the player taking on the role of a badass soldier sent into the ancient Egyptian city of Karnak. And then you soon find out an alien race called the Killmart are trying to resurrect King Ramses and siphon his power for their own nefarious purposes. And it's a really interesting game, I think, for a whole lot of reasons, beginning with just how confusing the title can be. I mean, this thing's either called PowerSlave, Exhumed, or as the Japanese call it, Serike 1999, Pharaoh no Fukatsu.
Stop it. Get some help.
Anyway, it's now the latest in a long line of remasters by Night Dive Studios, coming out just after they're probably done counting the money they made off that Quake remaster.
We're in the money, we're in the money.
And I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone who hasn't played the original and still doesn't talk about it fondly to this day. I mean, there's a reason why some versions of this game are so expensive on eBay, and it ain't because of that cover art, believe me. Now, I did a video a few years back on PowerSlave EX, which is kinda similar, but the difference this time is that PowerSlave Exhumed is actually official, combining elements from all the various ports of the original game and adding a few quality of life inclusions along the way. You see, there was actually 3 main versions of this game released. There's the PC version, which is really more or less just a pretty standard first-person shooter running on the build engine.
That's right.
Yeah, the same build engine that powered games like Duke Nukem 3D, Shadow Warrior, Blood, and Witch Haven 2. It's got some pretty cool inventory items and some fun level design, but it's really more or less just a key hunt through a couple of dozen levels. Then, on the other hand, you've got the console versions for both the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation. What's going on with my voice, man? Then on the other hand, you've got the console versions for both the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation. Now this version has outright Metroidvania elements. With a map screen and all these various upgrades you had to find throughout these various levels to access new areas in the game. Like you had magic sandals that could let you jump higher, there's a mask to let you breathe underwater, a shore which lets you float safely to the ground, a scepter for getting through force fields, anklets to protect you from lava, and then finally a magic feather that lets you hover in the air. Yeah, a magic feather. And you'd be putting all of these to good use, even to go back and collect optional items like unks that increased your maximum health points, or the couple of dozen developer dolls hidden in the most arse-holish locations.
What is that?
Oh yeah man, these things are hidden in the most insane spots, and required not only just the right abilities to find them, but then also an incredible amount of patience and skill to actually get them. Like one involves moving through a goddamn laser field, like it's that one scene from Mission Impossible. But then these could unlock these really fun abilities, like being able to fly around or turning you into a dolphin whenever you touched water. Yeah, literally. Apart from all that, this version also had 2 different endings, and only through finding 8 hidden transmitter pieces throughout the game could you get the good one. Finding all of these allowed you to radio for an evacuation chopper, making a harrowing escape from these crumbling ruins like it was the end of an Indiana Jones movie. Now, to this day, I've still seen people refer to this thing as a Doom clone, and that'll never fail to bring my piss to an absolute boil. Calling it a clone of anything is just really underselling it, and I think it's honestly one of the best console shooters of that generation, I mean especially for the PlayStation. I mean, don't get me wrong, there were some pretty good shooters on the PlayStation, like the Quake 2 port, you had Alien Trilogy, Doom and Final Doom, but all of those had or were based off PC ports, and they were pretty much just the same but on a different platform and heavily optimized. PowerSlave, meanwhile, is out here doing its own thing entirely. Overall too, I wouldn't ever really say that the consoles are the best version, because I do think each platform has its own strengths and weaknesses, and looking at them side to side, there's actually some pretty big differences.
No shit.
Right, so in both games you start off with a machete, which is mostly just used when underwater to deal with the legions of piranha fish that await you. Then after that, you get both a revolver and an M60 machine gun, and actually on the PC, these both needed to be reloaded. In fact, if you look closely at that M60 weapon sprite when you're firing it, you'd actually see that ammo belt getting less and less as it got closer to needing a reload. On the Saturn or the PlayStation, you can just fire both these bad boys until you run out of ammo. Instead of a pretty standard grenade on the PC, the console instead had this thing called the Bomb of a Moon, which exploded on impact as opposed to a delayed fuse. Not to mention, it was also necessary for destroying weakened walls, making it much more useful during gameplay. Now both versions share the flamethrower and a serpent staff, and although the sprites differ, they're pretty much more or less the same. Now I don't think I need to explain what a flamethrower is. And the serpent staff is basically just a heat-seeking rocket launcher. Yeah, heat-seeking and rocket launchers, two things which always complement each other. Then on the consoles, you've got the Ring of Ra and the Sacred Manacle. The ring shoots out all these bouncing projectiles, which turns the screen into a pixelated nightmare. But it's a pretty effective weapon if you want to cover a room in a bunch of bouncy looking shit and kill everything that moves. Then that Sacred Manacle fires out a charged up lightning bolt. On the PC though, you had none of that, just being given something called the Eye of Ra, which was a gauntlet that summoned a storm cloud to drop lightning bolts down on enemies, which always kind of reminded me of those flying Koopas in Super Mario Brothers. Now more than that, the PC version used red chalices to restore your health and then blue chalices to restore your power, which was needed to use all the inventory items like invulnerability, invisibility, and extra damage. The consoles just used these generic weapon and health power-ups, blue for weapons and red for health, with the catch being that they were only applied to whatever weapon you had equipped, compared to the PC's more traditional ammo pickups that were specific for each weapon type. Savvy? Then on the consoles, you could even extend your maximum health points by picking up those hidden unks, essentially giving you up to 5 health bars to burn through, whereas the PC just had this old school life system. Yes. So I think overall the main difference is that in the console port, you really felt like you were becoming stronger as a character, but on the PC, you were just kind of really finding bigger and better weapons and items. I mean, it's not a bad thing, but it really does kind of highlight just how different both versions are. I think what's even more interesting is that on the PC, your character is a lot more vocal.
That's right.
Spouting off all of these one-liners during combat. And I think my favourite's probably like his evil little laugh he does after you use that mummy stuff. This is around that time when Duke Nukem, Lo Wang and Caleb all kind of ruled the roost, and it was almost some kind of cardinal sin to not include a bunch of one-liners to go along with your gruff, masculine protagonist. I mean, on the console in comparison, he was basically a mute. Also kind of ties in, I think, too, how the PC version feels a lot grittier, like there's far more gruesome elements you'll come across, and the boss fights, although they're the same visually, are also a bit different. I mean, the one against Set, for instance, ends with all these souls coming screaming out of his bloodied corpse, and the sight of that, man, is just fucking gnarly. There's also some pretty gruesome death animations too. Like for the standard one, you'll just see all this blood come spilling out of your guts. But then if you're killed by like an explosion, you'll even see the flesh ripped off your arms. If you run out of lives, it also ends with one of the most traumatic game over screens I think I've ever seen. I mean, look at this shit, man. It's the goddamn stuff of nightmares. I should also mention too how awesome the soundtrack in both of these games are. It was only about half a dozen or so tracks in total, but these very quickly get stuck in your head, and they always kind of seem like they'd been chosen appropriately for the level itself. I mean, the music you'll hear in those levels featuring a lot of combat is entirely different to the ones you'll hear when you're swimming around these empty submerged tunnels of a sunken temple. So overall, you can really start to see that there is some pretty big differences between both of these games. And about the only thing keeping the whole thing together is that same premise about working with King Ramses and trying to stop the kill mark.
There you will find the last of the 6 artifacts.
So I guess my point after droning on about all of this bullshit is that if you're hoping for some kind of resurrection for the PC version, well then I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but this ain't it. Fans of the console versions can stop their grinning and drop their linen though, because this is a pretty faithful adaptation of the Saturn and the PlayStation 1 version to the PC. Obviously the main benefit to this remaster is being able to play through the whole thing with a much higher resolution and smoother controls. I mean, trying to aim up and down in the PlayStation version, for instance, was just incredibly clunky. And I mean, looking at the old versions versus this new version, the difference is just staggering. There's definitely still something appealing about playing it on those old consoles, and I'm actually pretty addicted to that dithering effect on the PlayStation 1, but playing it now in a high fidelity really does let the artistry come through now with things like the geometry and the architecture.
No shit.
I mean, it's definitely not as detailed as the PC version was, but it's still pretty damn good for the time, given the capabilities and the limits of what they had to work with. You can actually clean the image up pretty well if you want to, though I still kind of like the game looking somewhat vanilla. There's even that option to kind of leave in that weird sort of wobbly effect from the original engine too. Then if you're a hipster, there's even the option to play through the game with a CRT filter, or to play it in like a low resolution mode, to make it look even more like its Sega Saturn and PlayStation counterparts. I think it's a neat option, but I can't really imagine why anyone would want to play the game like this. I mean, you may as well just cover your eyes in Vaseline and put on a pair of prescription glasses that aren't yours.
Lisa, just because you're 10 feet tall doesn't mean you can tell me what to do.
I'm bored. Give me those.
You can choose between the original pixelated world map or a much crisper, cleaner looking update that actually looks like it's had a bit of effort put into it. There's even the option to turn on a crosshair, not that it's really needed all that much because the auto aim in this thing is pretty damn filthy, but again, hey, it's there. But I think the real interesting thing that PowerSlave Exhumed has done is combine elements from both the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation version. And in some ways, it's also kind of improved upon them. Like now the layouts of certain levels, whilst still the same, have actually been expanded to make them feel less claustrophobic. Even from that opening level in Karnak, the environment just feels much more opened up now, making it feel less constrictive and also allowing for much more range of movement. You'll really notice this throughout the remaster, where it's like they've kept the feel of the level itself, but just kind of widened it to give you a bit more fighting room. There's enemies from both versions also combined now, like the spiders and the scorpions. Now originally it was the Saturn and the PC that had the spiders, and then the PlayStation that had the scorpions. But now it's all just one big gangbang, and all these guys are invited. To be honest though, I'm not really fussed about this. I mean, both spiders and scorpions can all burn in hell for all I care, and I will never forgive scorpions for what they did to Auntie in Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. And don't get me started on wasps either, though at least the wasps in this one aren't even half as annoying as the PC version. Anyway, aside from that, it's also still taken sprites from the PC, like just to make it even more confusing. Like the Serpent Staff uses the PC sprite as opposed to the PS1 or the Saturn. There's always been something so fun about the sprite work in these games and the way that enemies often just outright exploded when they got killed, and it's actually kind of cool now to see the inclusion of these new death animations, so now they're only going to explode if you use the appropriate weapon. Then there's a few things that I think this remaster just objectively improves, one of them being the platforming sections, which are just like night and day when compared with the consoles. I finished this thing a few times on the PlayStation, and while I wouldn't say that the platforming is like super hard, it is definitely tricky with a controller. A lot of the difficulty is circumvented by items like the shawl and the feather, which give you a pretty big margin of error, but then there's those sequences where you've got to like drop down these super deep pits, along with avoiding enemies, and it could often be pretty hard to balance both the platforming and the threats of these nearby enemies. Well, on the PC, you don't have to worry about any of that, and the mouse and keyboard setup makes these sections a piece of piss. There's a level called the Sunken Temple, and yeah, you probably know what you're in for there. Yeah, it's an entire temple underwater.
Of course!
And I was really loathing having to play through this thing again because on the console, it's about as fun as being waterboarded, which funnily enough is basically what you're putting your character through in the game. At first I was afraid I was petrified, but it turned out this was much easier with those improved controls. So now you can actually worry more about the puzzle and the exploration aspect, and less about basic navigation, or struggling to get back to the surface for a much needed breath of fresh air. And combined with that chilled out music track, it was like I was relaxing in an isolation tank or something. Bomb boosting is now something that's actually also a lot easier too. This is where you use the Ammon bomb to essentially rocket jump through the levels, and while it was always possible on the Saturn version, for some reason you couldn't do it on the PlayStation. Well, now you can. And I think we're going to see some pretty filthy speedrun strats because of this as well.
Of course!
But you know what I appreciate the most is the inclusion of new checkpoints. Because there were a lot of times when you'd be playing through these really long challenging levels and then suddenly die on a platforming sequence and just have to replay the entire thing all over again. I mean seriously, if you touched a single pixel of lava and didn't have the anklets, you'd die immediately, no matter how much health you had. this version seems to rectify that, putting the odd checkpoint here and there, usually before like a really tricky section, so you don't feel like you're getting sucker punched in the throat anymore. There's a bit in one of the later levels where you've got to navigate down this pit that's got lava on all sides, and then after reaching the bottom, defeat 3 of these mag mantis enemies, which are these creatures that pop up from the lava and shoot out fireballs. You originally had to do the whole thing in one go, and as you'd expect, it was pretty tricky. These guys could pop up literally from any direction, and trying to deal with all 3 of them at once could be pretty damn tough. Well, now in the remaster, they put a checkpoint at the beginning of this fight, saving you from having to go through the whole thing over and over again. And it's the small touches like that which I don't think they make the game easier, but they just alleviate some of the needless replays through these kind of sections that you've already overcome. Oh, and about that infamous hidden laser field, you know the one I'm talking about? Well, there's a checkpoint just before that one too. But if you really want to keep that hair on your chest, well, good news. You can even turn these checkpoints off in the game's options.
That's right.
Still though, it doesn't make PowerSlave any less challenging. In fact, in 2 pretty big ways, they've actually made it even harder, with the addition of these 2 new modes, Hard and Pharaoh. Not only does this increase the enemy count to what honestly feels like it's around double, but it also increases the damage enemies do on top of it. Yeah, goody gumdrops. Pharaoh mode's also kinda like Nightmare mode in Quake, increasing the rate at which enemies fire as well, you know, in case increased damage wasn't enough. And you're gonna need a combination of some serious patience and some serious cojones to make it through the game on this difficulty. I mean, some of those later levels against the kill mart are the kind of thing that just really builds character, and that's putting it mildly. To be honest, I'm kind of on the fence about these new difficulties as to whether or not I'd recommend them, only because it's not like they're official modes added in by Lobotomy Software or anything like that. Now look, I usually go for the hard modes when I play games. It's not because I'm trying to show off or brag, but I just genuinely like my games to be somewhat challenging. Plus, I think if a game is fun on hard mode, well then it's usually a good indication that the game's been designed well. I mean, if you can understand and learn from how you were defeated, well then it makes for a sense of progression as a player, you know what I mean? It's why I think I like Doom Eternal so much, and why Nightmare difficulty really became the norm for a lot of players, you know, myself included. But I feel that hard mode in this is really just aimed at people who are already familiar with the base game, and I definitely wouldn't recommend this for a first time playthrough. And I mean, even though I know the game pretty well, I still got into some tough spots here and there, and I almost considered starting over. I didn't, by the way. And I think the main reason for that is because of the RNG system for how health and ammo is handled. Right, so like I said before, unlike the PC version, the console versions use health and ammo power, and these either drop from enemies when they're killed or can be found inside containers. The thing is though, these are entirely random, so you're kind of always at the mercy of what the game is going to give you. Plus, the game doesn't distinguish if you need either one of them. Do you know what I mean? Like, you could have full health and no ammo, but the power-ups are still all going to be health power-ups. Just to kind of fuck you up even more, sometimes there's going to be traps inside these containers, which fire out these homing projectiles that do massive damage.
Surprise, motherfucker!
It's just a bit of a shame that the remaster couldn't balance this out in some way, and as a result, there's going to be sections where you've got no ammo, but then heaps of health points, or, you know, vice versa. What it does is kind of force you to go back to early levels and then farm these health and ammo power-ups, which in fairness was a pretty big aspect to the original. Like I said, I guess I hope they'd just been able to kind of balance out these power-ups a bit better. The other thing I think is how the player's hitboxes work, and if you're used to how hitboxes in something like Doom, Quake or Duke Nukem 3D are, well then you're in for a pretty big shock when you play through this.
Let's see that in an instant replay.
Because it feels like you're playing as a guy who's got like basketball-sized deltoids or something, and it's like you take hits you feel you should have avoided. But again though, yes, this was an aspect to the original games, so if anything, maybe I should be praising it for being carried over so faithfully.
That's right.
All up though, PowerSlave Exhumed is a pretty easy recommendation. I've often been accused of being a shill and also selling my body for a slice of soft cheese. But you know what, if I'm a shill for suggesting people go and play this highly accessible remaster to one of the best FPS games that no one's played, well then strap a cage on my nuts and call me a shill. It's just a classic experience that comes from that time when all it really took to make a game was a handful of people who were really passionate and dedicated to their craft. You look at all the behind the scenes photos of the dev team from back then and it's really like looking into a bygone era. And I think that's an energy and vibe that's still felt now in 2022. with achievements to unlock and 31 hidden dolls to find, along with a campaign to master on Pharaoh mode, there's a fair chunk of value to be had here. Now, if only Night Dive could give Alien Trilogy the same treatment, well, then I'd die a happy man.